All right, peeps, on today's episode of The Kung Fu Genius, there is no Dre. There's just me and Bruce Lee expert and author James Bishop, who wrote the Tao, which is the source book on the Tao of Jeet Kune. Super excited to get him on. So, I don't know, let's get to it.
And every day, I practice martial arts. Watch out!
So, James, it's awesome to have you here on the podcast. Thank you so much for doing the KFG.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I talked a little bit about you and your book in some recent episodes. So you have recently come out with a new book, which all the Jeet Kune people seem to be talking about. And so it's Who Wrote the Tao? And essentially it's a source book on where Bruce Lee got his sources for the Tao of Jeet Kune. We're going to get into it, but before we get started, what gave you the idea to write a book like this about, finding out and going through and finding all those sources?
Well, I had done a little bit of discovery back in the early 2000s, which I published in my book, Bruce Lee Dynamic Becoming. That was a few hundred examples of things that were wrongly attributed to Bruce Lee. But at the beginning of this year, I'm always bothered by the preponderance of misattributed quotes to Bruce Lee on the internet.
Yes.
And finally, I said, you know what, I'm going to do something about this. So I started this little study. I had, over the years, one of my research projects had been to identify the books that were in Bruce Lee's library. No list has been publicly made available. So I've had to do research, and some of that research involves things as granular as magnifying the images of Bruce Lee's library in pictures and identifying books that way. But I've identified up to this point close to 1,200 books in his library.
Wow.
Which gave me a base from which to do this research on the quotes, assuming they came from the books that he owned. And so I began accumulating copies of the books that he owned, and I started digitizing them. So scanning them and turning them into PDFs, and created this giant database of these books. And then I started running the quotes against the database.
Wow.
And that's
so how long did it take you so from starting this project to getting this book published, how long did it take you to do all that?
So as far as the study, to accumulate what's in that book took me about 4 months, start to finish.
Wow.
In my spare time.
Wow, that's incredible, considering the book is unbelievably thorough. So for those of our listeners out there who don't know, this is not just a book kind of citing where Bruce Lee got these sources. It's actually a page-for-page source book. So page 10 of your book, it matches with page 10 of the Tao of Jeet Kune. So you can basically open your old, it's funny, at the beginning of the book you said, so you can open your dog-eared version of the Tao of Jeet Kune. I'm like, that is exactly mine here. I've had, yes, there you go. We all have these, I got mine in the 90s, and I just opened it up, and then you can open your book to the same page, and you see just, bit by bit where these came from. And it was fascinating because, even stuff like where Bruce had his drawings, where he has all the different weapons at the different ranges, even seeing that may have been borrowed from one of like Ed Parker's Kempo books, and just to kind of see, and it makes so much sense because obviously he was a product of the books he was reading at the time, the things that were out at the time. And when the Tao of Jeet Kune came out, even as a teenager, I generally understood that these were a collection of his notes. And I didn't really understand about there being a controversy about the authorship, because I think by the time I got it, it already had the acknowledgments as to like the Hazlitt book and stuff like that. But when it first came out in 1975, it was, and you have a kind of an example of one of the original advertisements for the book in your book. It was basically advertised as a book that was written and illustrated by Bruce Lee, essentially as an original work. in 1975, 2 years after he passed away.
And
Was that
I think everybody involved at the time believed that,
okay?
including Linda. I think they were functioning from the belief that these were Bruce Lee's original writings.
Got it. Yeah, because I think that may be where the controversy starts, is that obviously Bruce was writing notes on the books that he was reading. You know, this was his shorthand. He didn't have an iPhone with a note app back then. He had to write these things out. Yeah, I was curious, what your take was, whether Mito Uehara, where they kind of understood that these were his notes from other writings, or they really did believe that he was the originator. So you believe that they thought that these were all his original ideas?
I think they believed that in the beginning, yes, during the production of the book.
Got it. And then there's also a very interesting story about the first person who kind of caught on to the fact that maybe the authorship is in question. He was this Joseph Snyder Jr., who bought the book in 75 on pre-order. So I guess he was like one of the first to get the book.
He was.
For his daughter who was doing martial arts. And then he started, after a little while, he kind of had this spidey sense that he had maybe read some of these notes before. And can you tell a little bit about that story, about how he contacted the Lee estate? I find that that's kind of interesting, how he got the ball rolling.
Yeah, so he got the book and he started reading it, and he realized there was something familiar about it. He just happened to have a copy of Hazlitt's boxing book, which he bought back in World War II when he was serving in the military.
Wow.
And so something just told him, go crack open that book. And he cracked it open. He immediately realized, that these were verbatim passages from Hazlitt's book. And so he started investigating a little bit more, and he discovered, I think, about a half a dozen authors' contributions in the book, and then, set out to contact Linda and the publisher to make them aware of these things. Now, initially, they were happy to get this information from him, and he was in contact with Adrian Marshall, the Lee estate's attorney. They added the acknowledgement. They stopped the release of the book for a short time until they got legal permission from those authors, and added that acknowledgement at the front of the book. But as he found more after that, he tried to contact them again, and they weren't so receptive to yet more examples of misattributed material. In fact, he found himself being sort of, blocked out at that point. They didn't want to hear it anymore.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine it may have been a little tricky if they had to then go and find more authors that they had to get permission from, and perhaps some of those authors would have either wanted money or wouldn't have been cool with it, so then they would have had to change it. So it probably was it seemed like it was just getting a bit more messy for them. So that's a very interesting aspect. One of the things I love about your book, besides the fact that it's absolutely thorough, is that you say you found 85% of the sources. So does that mean that 15%?
Probably more at this time.
More since wow.
Because I've found some since the book went to print.
Wow, incredible. Can you make an estimate, or is that impossible, as to how much of this book is actually originally Bruce Lee's idea, as opposed to something that he, was inspired from?
I would feel comfortable making would be that at least 90% of it's not going to be Bruce Lee.
Wow. And I think that Bruce Lee has undeservedly got a bit of a bad rap for that. I remember a few years ago, even Joe Rogan on his podcast was kind of squawking that, like, oh, well, I heard the Tao of Jeet Kune was just plagiarized from someone else, almost as if the Dragon the Bruce Lee storyline was true, that Bruce Lee had somehow written this book during his lifetime and just plagiarized a bunch of other authors. This book was published after Bruce Lee's death, obviously in a void of, a time where people wanted new Bruce Lee material, and, anything about Bruce Lee was hot. So publishing his notes, I think, was a very kind of logical choice, but maybe because the publisher overstepped their claims about the authorship, Bruce Lee, I think, kind of undeservedly gets a bad rep of having released a book that he plagiarized when, first of all, this book was never released or was never planned to, these notes were never planned to be released. What do you think about that in terms of like the legacy of what this book means? Because I'm sure you got a little bit of pushback publishing this stuff from like the Bruce Lee fanboys, like you're kind of outing him or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of this book and, you know, why maybe Bruce Lee shouldn't get such a bad rap, even though maybe it might seem like you're trying to out him in some kind of way. So what do you have to say?
Well, it wasn't just pushback from the fanboys. Yeah, obviously there was some of that, but you know, I even got a call from Taki, you know, back in 2004 when I released the first book, Dynamic Becoming, that had the original set of misattributed quotes. And he asked me, "What am I doing? Why are you doing this to Bruce?" I said, "I'm not doing anything to Bruce.
Right.
I'm setting the historical record straight, you know." But as far as Bruce getting a bad rap because of this, yes, he didn't publish it, and we don't know how these materials would have been published in his lifetime. The Tao of Jeet Kune that he was putting together, actually, the content from that forms the basis of the Bruce Lee fighting method books.
Right.
So the stuff
right.
that Bruce actually had started to produce for the Tao of Jeet Kune book is in the Bruce Lee fighting method books. These were his notes, but you know, one criticism you can level is that clearly he had not cited his sources when he was putting these notes together, which itself is problematic. If he intends to use these notes, he's not going to remember where he got them from. You know, there's so many of them, he couldn't possibly keep track of that. But the idea that Bruce is not a plagiarist simply doesn't hold, because I personally have found evidence of Bruce Lee plagiarizing.
Okay.
From his days as a student at the University of Washington, Seattle, all the way through the end of 1972.
Wow.
So things that he published or things that he presented as his own original writing, I have found plenty of evidence that he was plagiarizing.
Wow. Interesting. You mentioned
liberate yourself from classical karate.
No kidding.
There's at least one passage in there, at least one, that is verbatim lifted from another source.
Wow. Incredible. I always felt, you know, because of Bruce Lee's, I guess, inspiration from Krishnamurti, that turned me on to reading a lot of Krishnamurti. And one of the interesting things is the more I started to read Krishnamurti, the more I started to kind of hear Jeet Kune in my mind as I'm reading these passages. And a lot of people talked about Bruce Lee being heavily influenced by like Alan Watts. And I always felt, no, I think it's actually way more Krishnamurti. And in the back of your book, one of the amazing sources you have or references you have here is you kind of put by author how much of a percentage of the Tao of Jeet Kune comes from this guy, or how much of it is about boxing, how much of it is about this, that, and the other thing. And Krishnamurti, I think, was number 3 or something, or he was like at least in the top 5 there. And I always felt that Krishnamurti had far more of an influence on Bruce Lee philosophically than, say, Alan Watts. And I always felt that liberate yourself from classical karate was very Krishnamurti influenced.
Yes.
It definitely felt like that was kind of ringing through in that article.
It's true. And Krishnamurti himself, his ideas were very, very similar to Zen. Okay, there are some clear parallels there. So I think Bruce was also studying Zen, as you know it, and I think it kind of meshed very well, these two sources of philosophical ideas for Bruce Lee.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Kung Fu Genius listeners, if you're looking for an easy way to support this podcast, please consider joining the Kung Fu Genius Patreon. You could support for as little as $5 a month and get access to episodes a few days early. Higher levels of support get additional goodies, exclusive content, and even your name in the description. The baller level of support will give you the opportunity to be a Dre for a day and give me a rest from this guy over here. A link for the Kung Fu Genius Patreon page is in the description below. You can also support us by subscribing to the Kung Fu Genius on YouTube, liking
liking this video and sharing it on your social media platforms. When you subscribe on YouTube, don't forget to hit that bell for notifications so you will know as soon as a new episode or a premiere is available for you to watch. For those of us who listen to us on audio, it's a huge help if you don't just rate the podcast, but also write a review wherever you listen to the Kung Fu Genius, such as Apple or Google Podcasts. I really appreciate it. And now back to me.
Gonna take a short detour from the book and talk about a video that you released recently on your YouTube channel.
Yes.
Which I watched a few times in preparation for this interview. You talk about whether Jeet Kune is an open or closed system.
Yes.
And this is a topic I talked about recently about, again, it always, even though I'm a Wing Chun guy, I'm not a JKD guy, but I always get asked ad nauseum what my opinion is on the original JKD versus the JKD concepts, binary idea. And, first of all, I don't have any skin in the game. I'm not a Jeet Kune practitioner. But that doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. It's just that when people ask me this, I try to, my answer is, hey, if you want to do original Jeet Kune and that makes you happy, do it. If you want to do something called Jeet Kune concepts and that makes you happy, go do it. But because for me, I mean, hey, you're only here for a limited amount of time. Go do the thing that sparks joy. But that is slightly at odds with what I actually believe in terms of, I do have an opinion about it. And my opinion was always that Jeet Kune died in 1973.
I agree.
And it was very interesting when I saw your video that
or it became crystallized.
Crystallized, yes.
Yes.
I think your video needs to be watched by everyone who practices Jeet Kune or even wants to know a little something about this topic, about this debate, this very binary debate, because the way you broke it down, not just in terms of the arguments, but also comparing it to politics and also looking at other examples like what happened to Ayn Rand after she passed away, the idea of open and closed systems. Can you just explain very briefly, because I think it's just a very fascinating point to make. It also exists in Wing Chun and in anything, I think. The idea of the difference between an open and closed system and then how that applies to Jeet Kune Do.
Okay, so in social sciences, we talk about open and closed systems. And an open system is a system that is open to change. It's open to input and data from the outside environment that allows for continual change. A closed system is closed off to the outside environment, and it's sort of fixed. And I know these words are familiar to people who, have studied Jeet Kune Do. These are, the idea of something being fixed is a bad thing in the minds of a lot of Jeet Kune Do practitioners. But the fact of the matter is, my position is that Jeet Kune Do was Bruce Lee's personal expression of the martial art, that it was an open system in his life in the sense that he and he alone made changes to it, and he was constantly evolving. And had he lived, it certainly would have continued to evolve. But when he died, it crystallized at that point because he's no longer able to make those choices and those decisions. And anybody else that makes them, there's no guarantee that Bruce Lee would have advocated the changes that they're making. And, we need to be realistic here. When people seek out a Jeet Kune Do school to train, they want to train in what Bruce Lee personally espoused, personally practiced, and not necessarily to get training in a lot of different other martial arts that might not be something that Bruce Lee advocated. They want the Bruce Lee experience when they seek out Jeet Kune Do.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned about terms, the words, they mean something. Like when you bring up a certain sport or whatever, you made that joke about football. And then, of course, not everyone defines football the same way. I thought it was very funny. But yes, I mean, if you think about Jeet Kune Do, obviously there's some kind of idea about Bruce Lee, what he did, right side lead, that kind of idea. And a lot of what you see in Jeet Kune Do schools nowadays doesn't necessarily fall in line with that. So the thing is, how can they justify still calling it Jeet Kune Do? And then you made a really great point about Bruce Lee's Seattle era students like James DeMille, Jesse Glover, was the other one, Cowles, Mr. Cowles.
Joseph Cowles.
They did something different. They came up with their own name. rather than trying to claim that it was something like it's some type of Jeet Kune Do or whatever. They came with their own name, and then they were able to kind of develop it in their own way.
That was clearly out of respect to Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee didn't want them going off and calling what they did, John Fan Jeet Kune Do.
Right. I remember the late Ed Hart. He also had a name for it, which was different from the other guys. He just called it the stuff, which I thought was interesting. I mean, to a certain degree, they've also been able to avoid a lot of those controversies because they're not in that kind of argument as to whether Wing Chun should or Jeet Kune Do should be, just that which Bruce Lee practiced until 1973 or can be something else. You made a very interesting point at the end too, with basically your advice for Jeet Kune Do practitioners was that they should learn, the Jeet Kune Do, let's say, for lack of a better phrase, some original Jeet Kune Do, learn those techniques, and then go on and continue to explore and develop, but that perhaps they should at that point let go of the name Jeet Kune Do.
Exactly.
Yes. Do you think anyone is actually going to take that advice?
I think some people already have. I think even before I posted that video, there have been people who have studied Jeet Kune Do and have gone off and done their own thing. I think Matt Thornton, is one of those that immediately comes.
Right.
He gave it a different name, and I think he's getting more into the jiu-jitsu area there. And I'm not a purist. I studied at a concept school, so I've had exposure to things like Kali and Jiu-Jitsu and those sort of things that you might find at a concept school. Now, my concept school was very clear about, today we're studying Jiu-Jitsu, not Jeet Kune Do. And I think most schools, do a good job of doing that. Most concept schools do a good job of doing that. But I don't think that everybody is doing the best job at clearly delineating that. And one of the issues I see with Jeet Kune Do concept is the same problem I see with things like abstract art and things like rap. They're avenues of artistic expression, but there's also something baked into those avenues that allow for lesser talents, so to speak, to kind of do anything under the banner of these titles, right?
Sure.
So anybody can do anything, call it abstract art. We know there's a lot of fairly untalented people that can put together a hip hop song, And again,
Sure.
I'm not knocking hip hop. There's wonderful artists in the area, but it, like abstract art, kind of creates the opportunity for lesser talents to declare themselves an artist or a hip-hop artist, things like that.
Right.
I think Jeet Kune Do concepts has the same problem. I think we see, not so much in the U.S., but I see globally, a lot of people using the idea of Jeet Kune Do concepts to set themselves up as an instructor without any real training in Jeet Kune Do. Some of them may never have even met a Jeet Kune Do instructor, and yet they're setting up a school and they're calling what they do Jeet Kune Do because it's a concept.
Right. Yeah, it seems that they, on that side, on the Jeet Kune Do concept side, is that they've turned the term Jeet Kune Do, it's so nebulous as to kind of, it can kind of mean everything. And when something means everything, it ultimately means nothing. It's not defined anymore. And I think that there are a lot of great guys out there on the concept side, like Burton Richardson and guys who are doing really, really amazing stuff. And it can be argued that maybe Bruce Lee would have gone in this way, but I think the problem is making that assumption and then still using the name. I think the best line in that video is you were like, the problem is the name.
The problem is the name.
Is using it, and to that you also mentioned that Bruce Lee, like Lao Tzu, like many philosophers, contradicts himself. The great line which I had heard before about the Tao De Jing, the opening line is like the true Tao that can be defined is not the true Tao or whatever.
Yeah,
and then goes on to write.
The Tao that can be told is not the true Tao.
Yes, and then goes on to write 5,000 characters or whatever on that topic, right? And Bruce Lee also seemed to have kind of talked out of both sides of his mouth in terms of the definition of it. What do you think about that? So when there are contradictions, like you mentioned the letter that he sent to Jerry Poteet, who wanted to who kind of asked for permission to mix some of the Jeet Kune Do stuff with the Kenpo that he was doing, and then Bruce really didn't seem to be for that. He was saying this is, to teach this is a denial of this, and they should be taught separate. But then at the same time talking about how he hopes that Jeet Kune Do frees his followers from the shackles and bonds of that. So as you have studied...
Bruce also said that the name Jeet Kune Do, if it's a point of contention, it should just be wiped out. It's just a name.
Yes.
Right?
As you've obviously studied philosophy, and this is definitely one of your wheelhouses, these kind of contradictions that exist in great philosophical traditions,
particularly
how do those? Yes, how do those things get squared away? I mean, is it? How does one explain that? Is it simply a contradiction, and then one says, okay, there's a problem with this philosophy, or is it normal and acceptable that there are contradictions in a philosophy? I don't know what the arguments about that are. How they go around. Well,
the Western mind tends to overfixate on these contradictions. I think the Eastern mind accepts them as a normal part of the philosophical process.
Right.
Western philosophers can very often struggle with these concepts in Eastern philosophy, where the Zen Buddhists, for instance, will, be perfectly okay with the contradiction.
Right. Exactly.
So I don't know that they are resolvable. First of all, I think Bruce Lee, at different times had different thoughts about his art. Even there at the end, I think he fluctuated. Clearly, it's some sort of style, even though he called it, I have not created a new style. But
right.
if it's distinctive, if it has techniques and responses that distinguish it from another martial art, so that you can see a practitioner of Jeet Kune Do doing their thing, and you can say that's Jeet Kune Do, then it is a style.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
It's a style. If it's distinctive, there's something stylistic to it that you can recognize that differentiates it from other martial arts. So I don't think he liked this philosophical idea, but in actuality, it was a style.
Right. What do you think about, because I always joke that I'm like, Michael Jackson in the Thriller music video where he's just eating popcorn while the movie's going on. Whenever I see Jeet Kune Do guys going at it in the comments, I will often actually post that GIF file of Michael Jackson eating the popcorn, just watching these guys go at it. And in addition to the kind of very binary original JKD versus JKD concepts, then there's also another kind of sub-argument between the division between Junfan Kung Fu and Jeet Kune Do. Is this something that you've analyzed at all? Do you have an opinion or anything to say about that? Because that seems to be another hair that gets split among some of the JKD
that's just the
groups.
distinction. Yeah, that's just the distinction that Dan Inosanto made to differentiate the two. He chose to call the techniques, the specifics, Junfan Kung Fu, and then refer to Jeet Kune Do as an overall concept. Not everybody that studied under Bruce holds to that view. That's why the nucleus was created,
Right.
Because they thought that all of these original students of Bruce Lee and his wife thought that what Jeet Kune Do was getting diminished by this looseness of the terminology. And so they put together the nucleus to kind of preserve the techniques and the martial art as Bruce Lee advocated.
Right.
So, I think it's just an argument of semantics.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Interesting. Also, so if we come back to your book here, one of the things I think that some people misunderstand a little bit about JKD is they see a heavy boxing influence, maybe because of the way Bruce moved in some of his films, like Way of the Dragon, but it's very clear that fencing is probably one of the primary influences in terms of, let's say, JKD at distance. Would you agree with that? Or because the lion's share of the notes are about fencing, but that just might be because Bruce had the most interest in that. But did that actually translate to what he was teaching and doing? Do you think that fencing has more of an influence on JKD or boxing, or is that one of those things that's undefinable or difficult to say?
Well, I think it had a significant influence. I can't really say in terms of a percentage, but certainly I think Western boxing and fencing, one could make the argument that they had more of an influence than Wing Chun. They're toward what I see in the Tao of Jeet Kune certainly supports that. Most of the material taken from the Tao of Jeet Kune, that's not the philosophical stuff, but is the technique stuff, comes from those two sports, those two practices.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that being that obviously the Tao of Jeet Kune is a collection of Bruce's notes based on the books that he had at that time. One, there were really no Wing Chun books back then that he could have cited anywhere, not cited, apparently just written notes from. And it was also the one art that he had formal training in, so maybe that was a reason why it didn't feature so heavily in his notes. I did mention to you a moment ago while we were off air that in many of Bruce Lee's notes, the Chinese notes that he writes on the side actually reference Wing Chun quite a bit in terms of, he'll write something on this side in English, which is maybe from a book that he was reading, and then on the side there'll be a couple things about like, well, this is like pak sour, this is like chi sour, this is like this, and he always used Chinese essentially as shorthand for that stuff. There's also a fair amount of wrestling and grappling stuff in here too. What can you say about some of those sources that he was getting for grappling? Obviously, grappling is a very big topic nowadays, and it did look like Bruce Lee was investigating those things. What were some of the books that he, was looking at that time in terms of the grappling end of things?
Well, one of them that he took a lot of grappling out of was Jean LaBelle's book, Handbook of Judo. And there was a follow-up book that Jean LaBelle did that he also took a few things out of. He took some of the grappling out of the book Aikido and the Dynamic Sphere. So those Aikido techniques that you see in the book, which are obviously Aikido when you look at them, were taken directly from that book. And then he took a lot from some old wrestling books.
Yes.
Titles of which I can't tell you offhand right now. But some of these books were, 19th century, early 20th century material.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like, it definitely seemed like, unlike, I come from the Chinese martial art end of things, and I think that the very unique thing about Bruce Lee, regardless of whether he was citing these sources or he was just writing them down for his own personal edification, as Han would say, he was definitely an outlier in terms of Chinese martial artists, because most traditional Chinese martial artists at that time would be very hard pressed to crack a book open from any style other than their own, let alone something even outside of their own lineage. And it definitely seems that he was definitely more willing than others to do that. Now, we talked a little bit about some of the martial arts sources. There was one Chinese book that he did look into, which I think was a praying mantis book. Did you find? I didn't find a whole lot of Chinese kung fu books.
Yeah. There were a number of praying mantis books that I think there was this whole series of booklets, actually, that he took quite a bit from. Mm-hmm. And they're in the book. I can't remember who the author was offhand.
So there was like a praying mantis book, I think, from the Lok lineage.
Multiple praying mantis.
Yeah, right. Which is also on the Chinese side of things. There are a lot of people who they always talk about, Bruce had learned praying mantis from this guy or whatever. And then sometimes it gets a little confused because northern and southern praying mantis are actually two completely different styles. They're actually not from the same source. Right. And so there's a lot of like people talking about, he learned from this guy secretly and all this kind of stuff. But I think, maybe a lot of his inspiration actually came from these books. Now, outside of the martial arts sources in there, we talked briefly about some of the philosophical sources. Now, one of so I started looking when I got your book, I was looking at all the different authors and I started ordering a bunch of these books on Amazon. And one of the books that your book has now turned me on to is The Passionate State of Mind, which is by Eric Hoffer. A lion's share of the last part of Bruce Lee's book, especially where he's talking about like kind of mindset, I suppose, is from this book here. And I also noticed that your YouTube channel is also called the Passionate Mind, which is that from this here? Is that where you got this from? Or
No, that's not where I got it from. It's the name of my nonprofit that I run, my 501c3. And the reason I came up with that is one of my areas of expertise is the study of gifted and talented people. Okay. And I wanted to create a foundation or an institute where I could continue to do research in that area. But I wanted to make the terminology a little bit broader. So it's not just that. I can have a little more room in how I define what I do. So I chose the word passion instead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked briefly about Okay. Well, we talked briefly about Eric Hoffer when we were off air. He's really a remarkable person in terms of his background. And can you just talk a little bit briefly about what actually makes him very unique, I suppose, among philosophers?
Sure. So he's really a fascinating person. He was born in the early 20th century. He was his parents were poor. He had an accident at some point in his early childhood, he and his mother, and I think the accident led to his mother's eventual death. But for him, I think it was falling downstairs or something like that. And he ended up blind for most of his childhood. And in his early teens, his vision came back. Wow. And at that point, he had not gone to school, so he was uneducated, but he became a voracious reader the rest of his life. And after he grew to adulthood, he went off to the West Coast. I think he grew up on the East Coast. He went to the West Coast and became a longshoreman, which is a backbreaking job working on the docks.
Sure.
And during that time, he would go home to his little one-room apartment and spend his evenings writing all these philosophical ideas that he was coming up with, these inspirational insights into the nature of humanity and civilization. And he eventually put together something. His first book was called True Believer. It was about the nature of mass movements. And it was a big bestseller and kind of put him on the map. But at the same time, he was becoming famous for his writing. He was still working as a longshoreman. And he did that most of his life until I guess he got just too old to do it. Right. But what's amazing about him is his lack of formal education, and yet he had these incredible insights that amazed the world, and eventually resulted in him getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Yeah, it's incredible. Even Bertrand Russell talked about reading Eric Hoffer's books and talking about how sound the philosophy in there was. And it's interesting because at least this book here, I don't know how his other books are written, but it's written mostly in short aphorisms. Sometimes they're a little bit longer, but it's almost like tweets from back in the day. It's like these little blurbs that are just so incredibly insightful, and you can read one and just stop and just sit and think about it a little bit. They're really, really incredible.
Well, that book was kind of unique among his books, mm-hmm. because his other books, they weren't just little quotable bits, a collection of aphorisms. His other books were, long essays about certain aspects of humanity. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. When you talked about the kind of open and closed systems, and you mentioned Ayn Rand and her philosophy, do you have, and what happened after her death, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know we moved around it a little bit, mm-hmm. but when a philosopher or the founder of a school of thought passes away, it generally goes from an open system to a closed system, but does it necessarily have to do that? Does it depend on the structure of the the philosophy that was created. I mean, can you maybe talk about that example or maybe some other examples? Because I think that what people maybe don't realize about this whole thing about Bruce Lee is that it's actually quite common that these kind of controversies occur after the death of a founder of something. So maybe you can relate that a little bit to the Ayn Rand situation. Maybe, I don't know if there are other examples that of how these things were solved or not solved after the death of a famous philosopher, so to speak.
Yeah. So when a philosopher creates their own philosophical system, just by nature, it's their system. And when they die, it becomes fixed. So we see that, we saw that in Ayn Rand's case. There was a pretty great schism among her adherents at the time, with one group saying that, her philosophy of objectivism could be continually developed and evolved, and another that said, no, it's fixed to what Ayn Rand said it was at the point of her death. And it was that group, I guess you would call them the purists, that ultimately seemed to have prevailed. Her literary executor, the person that she personally chose to continue her legacy, holds to that view. So I think that was probably her wishes as well. You could say the same thing about some of the old philosophers like Aristotle or Plato. Their philosophy is their philosophy. You can't add to it. Now you can develop new ideas based upon it, but you call those things Aristotelian, or you call them Platonic, but you don't say this is what Plato advocated. This is Plato's philosophy, because Plato didn't say that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, these are very, very common problems. It's just that I think when people practice Jeet Kune Do, then of course it's top of mind because it's probably all over their feed and it's all they ever talk about. But actually this problem seems to exist in every school of thought, religion, martial art, any kind of institution. Obviously, we have it in Wing Chun too. Between the different lineages within the Yip Man family, and then even within one lineage, the people who want to just do it the way the Sifu did it, and the people who think it should evolve and go with the times, and all these people you can't put them in one room together, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the way that's solved is by simply letting go of the name.
Yes. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think that really makes a lot of sense. I think more Jeet Kune Do practitioners should watch your video. Now, let's talk a little bit about is the book available yet? Because I know you sent me an advance copy and people are asking me all the time, is the book ready? Is the book available for sale yet openly, or?
Yes, a limited edition, only 500 copies will be made. Hardcover is available right now through my website, whowrotethedao.com.
Okay.
People can go there and they can order the limited edition hardcover. A paperback will be out probably in January of next year. And that'll be available at all regular, book selling channels.
Got it. And your other books, are they available on your website as well, or are they also available openly?
They're available openly. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned that you're planning on writing more similar books. What are your future projects in terms of book writing?
Well, this wasn't, when I set out to do this study, I was looking mostly at the philosophical writings of Bruce Lee. Because that's my interest. And at some point during my accumulation of this data, I decided I would focus strictly on the Tao of Jeet Kune Do for the first book. So my intention is I'm going to have at least 2 more books on this subject, addressing the misattributions, wrongly attributed to Bruce Lee. And I will do an academic paper on it for a peer-reviewed journal. But those are my immediate plans. I have right now, probably another 1,000 identified quotes that don't come from the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, but were wrongly attributed to Bruce Lee.
Right.
So I continue that research as it goes.
Yeah, you could probably make a whole book on all the Bruce Lee quote memes that are on Instagram. Like, a photo of Bruce Lee, and then there's a quote that's like Napoleon Hill or Dale Carnegie or something like that. Or teach a, give a boy a fish, and you feed him for one day, and like Bruce Lee. Like, it's I kind of champion this stuff a little bit on Instagram, but it seems like a losing cause whenever these huge channels just slap his name on a quote, which is very obviously not his. I mean, how do we combat this? Should we just continually try to call this out? I mean, what do you think the strategy is?
I occasionally call it out. I see it all the time. I can't just do it all the time, or I'd be on these social media spots constantly, and I don't have time for that. But it's funny you mention that, because just this morning, in advance of this conversation, I decided to look at the official Bruce Lee Instagram account. And I looked through the entirety of October. And, they frequently post Bruce Lee memes, quotes.
Yes.
And every single one they posted during the month of October, I know that it's misattributed. I know the author, the true author of it. With the exception, they did 2 video quotes from the Pierre Burton interview, which obviously was Bruce Lee speaking in his own.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't know who's actually handling it. I'm a bit of a Bruce Lee nerd, not on the sources of all of his quotes, although I do generally tell what a Bruce Lee quote is compared to something that he had either written or it's just completely misattributed. But yeah, sometimes even the Lee official Lee channel will post a photo where they'll say, oh, this is from, the set of The Wrecking Crew, and it's like a photo that was in Hong Kong 3 years later or something like that. So yeah, I kind of feel that feeling when you see something that's misattributed, you on the quotes and me for like the locations and times of things like that. It's unfortunate because I think they are also part of the source of a lot of the misinformation. It's not just the people slapping those Bruce Lee's name on some kind of quote, and it is unfortunate. I don't know what Bruce Lee would have thought about that so many years ago.
Earlier this year on Twitter, I corrected a quote that was wrongly attributed to Bruce Lee. It was a Alan Watts quote, and I went on there and gave it a proper attribution. Said this is wrong, and the usual suspects didn't come and like my tweet. Right? It was like crickets. Like all these Bruce Lee fans that were posting this stuff. None of them wanted to like that tweet because I burst their bubble. The one Twitter account that liked the tweet, the official Alan Watts Twitter account.
Of course. Yeah. I think it's a bitter pill for some people to swallow. Look, I'm a huge Bruce Lee fan. I think he's a once in a lifetime type talent. He was amazing. He was ahead of his time in many respects, but I don't think that any of those things mean that we have to deify him in any kind of way where we can't have open and honest discussions about, the source of his quotes and things like that. And I think people have a hard time separating those things. I did a video about his drug letters last year that came out, the whole Bob Baker thing. And then every other week I get a death threat on there for having exposed it, even though the letters were already online. But people read that and they think I'm the one who put them out there or something. And I think that it's unfortunate that people can't kind of admire him in a more adult way and in a more even-handed kind of way. It's either he is the god of everything, or you completely hate him, and there's nothing in between.
On the Baker letters, what's interesting is, yes, it's surprising to learn that he was abusing drugs to that level, but those letters also gave pretty convincing evidence that on some level he was distributing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because, there's references to Linda was writing to Bob Baker saying, you won't make any money, this month because Bruce is busy, filming a movie. We bought the spoon and a scale. Bruce will have to determine the quality. You put all of these things together, and it's very clear that the only reason they would be having these discussions if that on some level Bruce is redistributing those drugs in Hong Kong. Yeah. And I don't think he was some big giant drug dealer. He was probably just selling it to people close to him that he knew and giving Bob Baker the money.
Right.
But it was clear that there was some distribution going on.
Yeah, and I think that the last couple of years of his life, while he was making those films in Hong Kong, they're really interesting because so much happened in that time, and I think the letters really illuminated a lot of things that were kind of going on when you kind of interlace this with his official daytimers, and then you put things together, and it starts to paint a clearer picture.
Some of his erratic behavior there at the end.
Yeah, especially pulling the knife on Lo Wei and his collapse on May 10th. It's interesting, but even just talking about it, it's always the no true Scotsman fallacy. Like, you're not a real Bruce Lee fan if you talk about these things. And the people telling me they think that Quentin Tarantino wrote all of those to get back at Shannon for calling him out about that depiction. And it was like, come on.
Wow,
guys.
that is a wacky conspiracy theory.
Yeah, but I've had that thrown at me many, many times. And the funny thing is that, the Lee estate never made a statement about the drug letters. They just basically buried their heads in the sand, and it seemed to have been an effective strategy.
What statement could they make?
Yeah.
I mean, they're very clearly authentic.
Right. Despite, people trying to please up to otherwise.
And one thing they show, unfortunately, is that Linda perjured herself.
Yes,
because
at the inquest.
At the inquest, yes. She said that Bruce Lee had not done any drugs other than a little bit of marijuana.
Right.
So
yes.
that's
And
not only is that perjury, but it's also insurance fraud. Because the life insurance payout was dependent upon her assertion that he had not been self-destructively abusing drugs.
Right, because of what he put on the application when he got the policy to begin with, saying that he didn't use drugs,
and she told the inquest and she told the insurance company what we now know were falsehoods.
Right, yeah, it's unfortunate. But on the other hand, when I first read the letters, it was a little bit of a punch to the gut. I've been a Bruce Lee fan since I was 8 years old, but it took me a couple weeks, and then I'm like, you know what? This just explains, I just know more now about what was going on, and it builds a clearer picture. And it's also possible to look at these things in a non-judgmental way. And I think that that's a hard thing for people to do, because they always want to prescribe some kind of value judgment to this kind of information, when even it doesn't affect most people one way or another. It's just information. You can look at it and go, okay, well, that seemed to be going on. And it's also possible to not have a big opinion about these things.
It's disappointing, but for me, what's sad about it is Bruce didn't get a chance, to clean up, to redeem himself in that sense. Right. Robert Downey Jr., made Bruce Lee look like an amateur when it comes to drug use.
Right.
Right. But
right.
he was able to. He fortunately lived long enough, that he could get himself help and clean himself up and become a productive member of society again. And, unfortunately, Bruce died before he had a chance to, get past all of that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, before he would have the chance to realize his dream of becoming such a big star and kind of surpassing Steve McQueen in terms of box office revenue and everything. It is unfortunate, but, I'm actually happy that these things came out, because it explains a lot, and it gives a context to what was obviously a very turbulent time period, and also a time period where he didn't really write that much, because most of these writings was when he was laid up with his back, and once he started making those films, there was really not a whole lot that he was writing at that time.
No, he wasn't. But I think that the last couple of years that he wasn't writing, it was because, of course, his Hong Kong career was taken off.
Right.
He was busy with that, so everything had to go to the side.
Right.
And I think that certainly he had more writing to do, and he had detailed plans of the things he wanted to accomplish in life. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to accomplish.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Well, hey, James, this was absolutely fantastic. I had a really good time. I could talk to you for hours about this kind of stuff. If you ever come to New York, please hit me up. I have so much stuff I would like to talk to you about and show you and things. And so I think it'd be really fantastic. And I look forward to this episode coming out. Is there anything else you want to plug or promote before we get out of here today? Or maybe just give your website again so people know where they can get that book.
Yeah, so the website is www.whowrotethedao.com. And you can order the limited edition hardcover there. Or if you choose, you can wait to the beginning of next year when the paperback comes out in all the usual places.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much, and I look forward to maybe talk to you again in the future when the next book comes out, and maybe after I read your book again. It's one of those books you have to kind of read and reread. It's not a one-time through type book. I'll have more things to discuss with you. So thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of The Kung Fu Genius. As always, don't forget to subscribe to The Kung Fu Genius, like this episode, hit that bell for notifications. If you have any questions or ideas for future interviews, go ahead and write those in the comments below. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.
Word is I'm a kung fu genius. Technique speaks for me, not lineage. Forget Jet Li, cause I'm the one. Many call me seafood, but to you I'm sea kung. And I produce masters. You surpassed us. Your kung fu stiffer than corpse and caskets. City Wing Chun is the house I built. Violate the gate and your blood gets spilt. Alex Richter, always the victor.